There's a certain purity to a game like Beton Brutal. There's no story, no characters, no world building, no context of any kind provided. And why would you need any? Your goal is obvious, and in fact it's the only thing you can do. Go up. Though the space above you looms dauntingly, impossibly high, in each moment of gameplay your singular concern is to look for the next step forward and reach it. That's all you need to do. Over and over again, hundreds of times and then thousands of times, just look for the next step forward and reach it. If it sounds simple or easy, that's because mostly it is. Your brain will have enough bandwidth going spare that it can even become quite a meditative experience as you slowly inch your way higher and higher, never being asked to focus on anything more than that next step and the input required to achieve it. But as the height you've already covered steadily grows, alongside it grows the potential loss of progress if you slip up and make a mistake. And this tension simmering beneath you is raised a couple of degrees with every successful step into uncharted territory. While the game mechanics do get marginally more involved at higher altitudes, any perceived increase in difficulty as you ascend mostly comes from the rising anxiety and sweaty palms caused by the knowledge of what will happen if you fall. The first time that happens to you and you find yourself right back where you started, it is a hard smack to the face, and all of a sudden you're forced to answer a question you knew was coming eventually, but until then had only been theoretical. Am I really gonna do this all over again? Within the game itself, of course you have no choice. You have to do it again if you want to proceed. But as the consumer of a piece of interactive entertainment, the player does have another option. They can simply drop it and never look back, as around 90% of them have done. Beton Brutal is far from the only game that dares the player to quit by repeatedly testing and retesting their commitment so brazenly, but as a particularly bare-bones example, I think it makes for a very illustrative one. You can also use footage from it to hypnotize Zoomers and iPad kids, which is always a bonus on YouTube. In grasping for a genre to place these games in, I find myself hesitating to just go with platformer and call it a day, because despite the focus on movement challenges, I don't think that fully captures their unique appeal. Likewise, calling them rage games feels a bit too reductive to me because there's usually a little more going on under the hood than that implies, though I won't deny that there's no genre of single player game more likely to make you angry than this one. Okay then, so what is the appeal? Why would somebody subject themselves to an experience that seems tailor-made to induce frustration? Well, I think part of the answer lies in that feeling of intense pressure so endemic to these games. Knowing that all the progress you've made so far is at stake every time you move is a very, very powerful source of tension, one that's more or less absent from the average modern blockbuster, littered as they are with checkpoints and customizable difficulty sliders. That's not to say I'm against those accessibility features necessarily, but I also don't think it's surprising that an antidote to that handholding has emerged and found itself a healthy niche. Obviously, losing a ton of progress to a single mistake doesn't feel great, but the risk of that happening is what makes your actions, simple though they are, feel so much more meaningful than in other games. Without that risk and without that tension, there wouldn't be much else to write home about here. In some sense then, these are games that largely take place in your head and in your nervous system, where the only enemy is the internal voice telling you to Alt F4 after a fall, and the only reward for continuing is the vindication of your own stubbornness. It's not just about mastery of the game, it's about mastery over yourself. To a certain extent, I think this is actually true for almost every game, though it gets a bit cloudier once you factor in narrative, characters, and other reasons why a player might get invested. But if you strip all of the non-interactive elements of a game away, the fundamental interactive layer that you're left with is really just a challenge to yourself, to prove to yourself that you're capable of completing this arbitrary task. So to repeat the crucial question, why would someone play a difficult game like this? The somewhat mundane answer is, because they can. Or to use a quote more appropriate to mountaineering, because it's there. Cairn is a game I was excited for the instant I saw its store page. Not only because it's by a developer I trust to put out a well-crafted experience, but because after being let down by the overly simple mechanics of Jusant, I was eager for a climbing game that could fully deliver on the concept of scaling a mountain alone from bottom to top, with all of the freedom, terror, and triumph that comes with it. If you too have been waiting for a game like that, then I can happily tell you right now, Cairn is it. It's not flawless of course, and it has its share of problems, even some pretty major ones, but when it comes to the core experience it offers, it gave me pretty much exactly what I wanted, and will likely be an easy nominee for the usual suite of yearly awards. Unlike Jusant, Cairn is not an arcadey 4-hour pick up and play romp. It's a methodical, palm-sweating, occasionally grueling ordeal that demands very long stretches of concentration and threatens harsh penalties for failure or poor planning. Rather than restricting you to a linear set of artificial and developer-defined handholds, Cairn allows you to move your limbs anywhere you please and has a physics engine calculating your weight distribution in real time, giving you both the freedom and the responsibility to choose not only your route up the rock face, but also the placement of every hand and foot along the way. True to form, this game will see you spending the majority of the runtime slowly inching upwards, focusing intently on nothing more than finding your next handhold and reaching for it, sometimes uninterrupted for long periods of time. The huge release of tension you feel when reaching the end of a lengthy climb like this places you in perfect sympathy with main character Ava, and you might even find your own hands a bit exhausted too. I promise this is the last time I'll pick on it, but replaying Jusant after beating Cairn was like going from Hitchcock to Teletubbies. There's a lot more to cover here, like the resource management considerations you have to take into account when planning your ascent. But I think the description I've already given, along with my glowing recommendation, is enough for you to decide whether you want to give Cairn a try before watching more, so this is your last chance to chalk up and attempt the climb for yourself. This is a game that asks for an upfront investment of patience and commitment, but if you stick it out until the end, then it will pay you back with interest. If you're put off by the potential difficulty, then rest assured that this is not a game that wants to troll you or waste your time, and it's quite generous with pittons you can place mid-climb to make your own checkpoints, with just a few limitations to prevent them becoming overpowered. There is one piece of advice that every player of Cairn needs to know, however. Before you even think about touching a wall, you need to open the options menu and set the manual limb selection mode to dial. I'll explain why later, but for now just trust me on this because I really wish somebody, or maybe, the game, had told me about this before my first playthrough. And with that, it's time to leave base camp and get started. In Cairn you play as Ava, a professional mountaineer setting out to become the first human ever to set foot on the summit of Mount Kami. Her unwavering determination to achieve this goal, at the expense of pretty much everything else in her life, leads to the main narrative tension in the game. And since the player needs to bring a large amount of determination to the table to reach the summit as well, that puts both parties nicely in alignment for most of the runtime. I'll come back to cover the story and world building later on, but for now I think it's best if we start with the absolute basics of how climbing works. Firstly, I think it's necessary to address the mountain itself, since its form naturally plays a major role in how you choose to approach it. While every rock face has been handcrafted by developers, it's seemingly been done with the aim of hiding the designer's hands and appearing as natural as possible, a goal which I'd say is mostly achieved. Observant players might notice the same formation appearing several times in a playthrough, but this is nowhere near common enough to detract from the experience. Far from having only one predefined path up a wall, the surfaces of Kami are scattered with an enormous variety of holes, outcrops, crevices, protrusions, ledges, corners, and cracks for you to grasp with desperate fingers or jam your bleeding toes into, creating a vast tapestry of handholds of differing quality and difficulty that you can scale in any way you choose. The game is remarkably steadfast in its commitment to simulating realistic rock climbing and nothing else. When I found a cave full of crystals, I was expecting that I would be able to use them to assist in my climb, but to my surprise they actually just disappeared whenever I got close to them. The same goes for ornamental ropes, which can't be grabbed onto, safety railings, which can be climbed through, and strangest of all, trees, which can be walked right through as if they don't exist. When I reached the final quarter and a new mechanic was finally added in the form of icy surfaces, I was almost shocked that the game was interfering with the formula it had stuck to so far. That's not a complaint, by the way. If anything, it's a compliment to the strength of the core climbing mechanics that they remain engrossing enough to carry the game without the need for extraneous gimmicks. Alright, that's enough about the mountain. It's time to talk about how the player actually interacts with it through those climbing mechanics. The fundamental gist is that you move one limb at a time and try to place it somewhere as secure as possible so that it can help support your weight while you move the next limb, and then the next limb, and so on as you crawl your way slowly upwards. That routine of one appendage after another is the basic principle that you'll be following for more or less the entire game, but there are a few more complicated tricks that will become second nature to you as you settle into the game, since arms and legs do have slightly different capabilities and behaviours. One particularly indispensable technique involves placing one leg higher than the other, then reaching up with a hand to stretch upwards by placing all of your weight on that leg. I swear it's more intuitive than it sounds. Another move that's useful when there's no obvious spot to put your next foot is securing both of your hands somewhere safe, then bringing each leg up one by one until they're level with your hands and walking your hands back up from there. It's actually a little difficult to put these maneuvers into concise words, and like all complex systems, this one has to be interacted with to be properly understood. I'm sure every player comes up with tricks of their own during their journey, but my point is that there's more depth to the climbing in Cairn than you would expect from a simple description, and with every wall presenting a unique challenge, you'll be repeatedly pushed past what you thought were your limits. Since there are no predefined handholds and all limb positioning is done dynamically, being able to spot the best places to put your hands and feet is the essential skill to cultivate while playing Cairn. So it's a good thing that feedback about the quality of different hold spots is immediate and intuitive. If your hand is placed flat on a wall with the fingers splayed out, then you know it's just resting there and is barely providing anything in the way of grip. If you're pinching a tiny outcrop by your fingertips, then you know it's better than nothing but won't be able to hold much weight. If your fingers are together and your hand is grabbing onto a corner or crack, then you know that you've got a secure hold and can move onto another limb with confidence. While it is intuitive to quickly spot the difference between these states and make corrections, it can be a bit finicky to get your hand exactly where you want it. It's uncommon, but sometimes Ava just won't grab onto an obvious hold that's right next to her hand, and will give the mountain a little pat on the side instead. For cracks and ledges, I found the best way to make this consistent was to move my hand a bit above the ledge before placing it, but for these little hole things, I would pretty much just have to try again and again until the hand went in. That might not sound so bad, and 9 times out of 10 it is only a minor annoyance. But if you're in the danger zone and only moments away from losing your grip and falling, that imprecision can and frequently will make the difference between life and death, or at least a bump on the head. Another action that can be unnecessarily finicky is moving from a wall onto a flat, walkable surface, which can sometimes be a comically long-winded ordeal. Placing a hand on the very top of a rock face usually results in Ava pulling herself up and going into walking mode, but this isn't always the case and is especially problematic when the surface you want to walk on is partway up a wall or is being approached from the side. Whenever you encounter one of these cases and have to spend a minute grappling with Ava's limbs on a more horizontal plane, your reaction will probably fall somewhere between disbelief, confusion, laughter and frustration, none of which I think are intended by the devs. There is a button you can press to immediately disengage from a wall, but because there's no guarantee whether it will lead to Ava calmly placing her feet on the ground or fully leaping from the wall into oblivion, I was never comfortable trusting it and just struggled through instead. Returning to a wall after resting on a piton can also be more irritating than you would expect, since the game will lower you back down for some reason, rather than just letting you reach your hands out to grab what's in front of you. Sometimes this leads to your limbs being automatically placed in what seems like the most unstable position possible, leaving you scrambling to quickly fix it. But at least with your checkpoint already secured, there's no loss of progress at stake, so it's not a big deal. Sadly, the same can't be said for the overly punishing ragdoll physics. Falling from a tiny height onto a surface you thought was safe, and then watching in horror as Ava flops around on the floor, slides slowly but unstoppably towards the gaping chasm below and tumbles thousands of feet to her abyssal doom is about as dispiriting as it gets. And just while I'm here, the lack of any kind of animation whatsoever for getting up from a fall is kind of ridiculous, and I'm honestly surprised the devs were comfortable leaving it like this, considering how many times the player is likely to see this across a playthrough. Say what you like about baby steps, but at least it has that. Finally, on the less consequential side of things, it has to be said that Cairn can get a little janky at times, with limbs warping and clipping through inconvenient scenery whenever you contort yourself into an unusual shape, and if anything, this starts to get worse as you approach the summit. The ice climbing boots allow you to cram your foot into crevices at an ankle snapping 90 degrees, and this looks so weird that it almost feels like you're cheating somehow. The thing all of these issues have in common is that they come as direct consequences of Cairn's freeform climbing, which is what allows you the freedom to reach for tricky holds, place your feet on flat surfaces, and creatively deploy pitons in the first place. So personally, I'm willing to cut the game some slack here. Creating a physics-based climbing system that accurately takes into account the weight and tension being held by each limb, and then giving the player fine control over that system to manipulate it as they wish, must have been a very hard problem to tackle. And if the devs came up a little short in the technical aspects, then I'm okay with letting that go in the interest of experiencing something original. This forgiving attitude isn't one that every player will share, however, and as these little grievances begin to add up, you may find the game hitting your threshold for how much patience you're prepared to sacrifice to it. As I said before, 9 times out of 10 these are all just minor annoyances, but every now and then one of them will appear at exactly the wrong moment during a dangerous situation to cause a catastrophic, unrecoverable loss, which feels a lot less forgivable. Unfortunately, I haven't even mentioned the biggest inconsistency of control that will really plague your time with Cairn. But before getting to that, I should probably backtrack a bit and explain how stamina works and what makes for a dangerous situation in the first place, since those are the moments where it really becomes a problem. During a climb, each limb has its own independent stamina stat being tracked under the hood, which will deplete when that limb has an unbearable amount of weight on it, and quickly come back when you're in a stable position that spreads the burden more equally. This means that stamina in Cairn is not so much a resource that has to be managed as it is a simple warning that you're off balance and need to correct fast, and to the game's immense credit, this means that there's no need to plaster a stamina bar on the screen, since Ava's dynamic audio and the exaggerated shaking of tired limbs convey more than enough information alone. I'm trying not to overuse this word, but once again I have to give the devs their due for crafting a very intuitive system here that can be easily sensed while playing without a bunch of bars and meters intruding on screen space. Admittedly, it's not always immediately clear why an arm or leg is shaking. Sometimes it looks like you're in a perfectly secure position, but Ava's legs still won't stop doing the Charleston. Thankfully though, there's a panic button that I presume was made for exactly this situation, and you can press Y at any time to rest for a second to temporarily regain some stamina, and much more usefully, to automatically move your limbs to the most secure position currently available. This is less overpowered than you might think, and usually still requires you to act afterwards to get yourself clear of danger, but it can save you in a pinch, or at least buy you enough time to deploy a panic piton before you fall. So, with stamina acting as this invisible resource that you'll want to avoid depleting as much as possible, in Cairn you're incentivized to climb methodically and purposefully, with every limb being thoughtfully placed in the best possible position. Another downstream consequence of this is that the order you move your limbs can sometimes make a very big difference to survival, which means it's time to dig into how the next limb you move is selected. If you haven't played the game yourself, you might be amazed by how much there is to say on this topic, so strap in tight. Okay, so first off, the game has an automatic limb selector, which as far as I know can't be switched off. As soon as you press the button to place a hand or foot, some sort of algorithm is run that takes into account the direction you're moving and the distribution of your weight, and selects which limb to start moving the next time you touch the stick on your controller. When it comes to the reliability of that algorithm, I can say without exaggeration that I was about 3 seconds into the tutorial when it became clear that it couldn't be trusted. The problem here is obvious enough. Even if the auto-select somehow aligned with your intention 99% of the time, which it doesn't, there's no way to know before any given move whether it's going to be in the 1% of misses, so you can't fully trust it to do what you want, ever. Even more annoyingly, the only way to learn which limb the algorithmic lord has selected is to move the stick and see which hand or foot comes loose, and if it's the wrong one, then you have to go back and undo the mistake that the game just made for you. This is exactly as bad as it sounds, and it doesn't make a great first impression during the game's first few minutes. But I'm being unfair, aren't I? Without the ability to read the player's mind, there's no possible way that an auto-selector like this could ever reach a reliability of 100%, right? Well, fortunately for game developers everywhere, there already exists a method for games to read a player's intentions, and it's traditionally done by using their inputs on a controller. Mind-blowing stuff, I know. Mercifully, Cairn wakes up to this fact near the end of the tutorial and informs you that you can hold a shoulder button to manually select a limb from a wheel instead of just hoping that the game will correctly guess what you want to do next. Don't breathe that sigh of relief just yet though, because the manual selector suffers from the exact same frustrating problem as the automatic one, albeit with a higher hit rate of getting the correct limb. How is that possible with the player in control of it, you ask? Well, the way you control it is through this selector wheel that asks you to point towards the limb you want to pick, and it works pretty much as intended under ideal conditions where each limb is stretching out in a different direction. As you might imagine in a game based around dynamic climbing, however, conditions are not always ideal, and you'll often find yourself in positions where limbs are crossed over each other, or a hand is hidden in front of your body, or you've just slipped and an arm is hanging by your side away from the plane of the wall. In those situations, the manual selector shits the bed completely and becomes unreliable in a way that's even worse than the automatic one. Think about it. Which way am I supposed to point the selector if the limb I want is inside the wheel? This is a Buddhist riddle with no answer, and it can cause you to spend a ton of time spinning the wheel around and around to try and figure out which precise direction corresponds to your desired limb. And that direction frequently doesn't match what you're looking at on screen. And it gets even worse if you can imagine that, because sometimes the limb you want is just utterly and totally 100% unselectable with no obvious reason why. But of course you won't know this until you've wasted several seconds searching every degree of your selector wheel in vain. Stacked all together, this list of issues is so tall it's got snowcaps forming on top of it, and it's hard to avoid giving a harsh condemnation of the limb selection mechanics in Cairn, given that this is something you'll be doing every few seconds of gameplay. The fact that you'll become aware of these shortcomings before you even leave the tutorial is pretty damning, and it's clear that these are fundamental problems right at the heart of the game. Now, all of that is true, and I normally wouldn't make excuses for such an obviously flawed system, especially one with such a glaringly obvious solution, more on that in a moment. But since I was able to enjoy and even love this game in spite of that flaw, I think it's only fair that I try to speak in its defense, or at least explain why I was willing to overlook it. Firstly, like all the issues of control in Cairn, the actual impact of it can vary wildly depending on the moment when it strikes, and in fact most of the time it's just another minor annoyance that can be quickly corrected and moved on from. But of course those aren't the times that will stick in your head. The times that will stick in your head are the ones where you were running low on stamina and trying to act fast to fix it, and you brought up the wheel to quickly select a foot, but it selected your hand instead, making you fall to your death and lose half an hour of progress. In those moments, I can't deny that this failure of control feels unforgivable, and I can even understand wanting to drop the game because of it. But you are given tools that can be used to mitigate the problem, in the form of the panic button I mentioned earlier, and the liberal supply of pitons that help to minimize the height of your falls. To be clear, falling due to poor controls is still very much the game's fault and not the player's, but that's why I said this is the main problem you just have to find a way to overlook, because for better or worse, it's part of the game. Or is it? As I said a minute ago, there's an obvious solution staring us in the face here. Instead of subjecting the player to an unreliable dynamic selector wheel, why not just assign each quarter of the wheel to a different limb? With a system like that, selecting a limb would work exactly the same way 100% of the time, which is the only acceptable level of consistency if you want a player to trust a game's controls. I spent my entire first playthrough thinking about how much this would improve the game and how easy it would have been to implement, and after 2 failed multi-hour free solo attempts that both ended because the controls screwed me over, I was about ready to give up and write a big rant about the perils of imprecise control schemes. So imagine my surprise when I watched a speedrun and realised that my exact suggestion for how to solve the selector problem is already in the game, it's just hidden in the options menu. After seeing this, I decided to give it another try and managed to free solo myself all the way to the summit on my next attempt, which was vindicating to say the least. If you're watching this and are as surprised as I was to discover that this option exists, I'd highly recommend giving the game one more try just to see what a difference it makes. The consistency introduced by dividing the selector into quadrants is objectively, quantifiably better than the dynamic one, and it completely solves Cairn's biggest problem, which is why I went out of my way to insist you do it back in the intro. But the fact that it's not the default option is so mind-meltingly baffling to me that it really makes me question what the developers were thinking, which is not something I say lightly. And would you look at that, I managed to include my big rant anyway. Okay, so with the principal issues of control out of the way, and mostly alleviated with some secret menu magic, we can zoom out to a wider view and some of the more long-term considerations that Cairn asks you to keep track of as you play. I'm happy to say that from here on out, my thoughts on the game are very positive. For the sake of continuity, let's stick with what happens on the wall before moving on to what you do on the plateaus in between major climbs. While your moment-to-moment objectives during a climb revolve around finding the next hold and reaching it, these little micro-goals are folded into the larger one of identifying the safest path upwards and ascending using as few resources as possible. At all times, you're free to choose whichever route upwards you care to make for yourself. And when I say that, I don't just mean that you get to choose a path from a list of options and try to tackle it. In Cairn, your decision about which way to go is an analog one that's made and remade with every placement of a limb. At any time you can switch direction in response to changing conditions or a better route that you've just spotted, and the freedom that you're trusted with is incredibly liberating and rewarding. While this is certainly no open world game, it's a lot less linear than you might expect, because there's a limitless number of viable routes up each rock face. When you fall and lose some progress, you almost always have the choice of trying a different route rather than repeating the same one again, even if you've already pittoned halfway up the wall. In a wider sense across the entire game, your choice of route will almost certainly see you missing out on several of the caves, campsites and other points of interest that can be encountered on the mountain, giving you something to look forward to exploring on a second playthrough or on successive free solo attempts. To aid you in this free-form pathfinding throughout the game, you can press a button at any point to freeze time, zoom the camera out, and manipulate it for yourself in a pretty ample radius around Ava, and naturally this ability is crucial for planning ahead. If you're anything like me, you'll make frequent use of it to make sure you're still on the right path, and to check how far you are from the top of your wall, which has an equal chance of either bolstering your determination when you realise you're closer than you thought, or filling you with despair when you're not. Through exploration, it's possible to find maps that will suggest possible routes, each one colour-coded according to difficulty, but I found these ratings to be very inconsistent, and you're usually better off just floating ahead with the camera to investigate for yourself whether you think a climb is doable or not. For purposes of gameplay then, access to this camera mode is pretty much essential. But I can't deny that a certain amount of tension is lost whenever you pull your viewpoint out like this and break the claustrophobic spell that the climbing camera usually keeps you under. It can also ruin the surprise of finding out what's waiting at the top of a wall or inside a cave, and effortlessly flying around like this does take some of the appeal out of exploration. Even when you're not climbing, the constraints of constantly draining resources and Ava's painfully slow walking speed mean that it's almost always a good idea to scout ahead with the camera to see if a cave or outcrop is worth your time, and I can't help but wonder if it would have been a good idea to prevent this exploit by limiting this camera mode to outside areas. It does have one more redeeming feature though, and it's one that I actually really love. While you're in this disembodied state, you can see your route so far mapped out beneath you, not only for the current wall, but for your entire playthrough all the way back down to the start of the game, which is a genius touch that wordlessly puts into perspective just how far you've come. It seems like the devs were pleased with this idea too, since you're shown a similar chart of your progress when selecting a game file in the main menu as well. This is possible because the entire game world of Cairn is just one long, continuous and unbroken map that can be traversed from bottom to top, with no shortcuts, cheats or trickery from the devs. Hold by hold, you climb the whole thing yourself, for real, and I've got to give the team their props for turning such an ambitious concept into a reality and making the mountain into one cohesive whole. As I've hopefully made clear by now, there's a lot more decision making involved in playing this game than you might expect at a quick glance, and that's before I've even got around to explaining the resource management mechanics, so let's add that missing piece to the equation to see what the experience of playing Cairn looks like in its entirety. During a playthrough there are 3 meters that you need to keep an eye on for hunger, thirst and warmth, and these bars can be replenished by eating, drinking, staying out of the cold or ingesting something hot, with most consumables being capable of restoring more than one stat if prepared correctly beforehand. To carry all of these consumables with you on your journey, you're given a backpack that seems big at first but will quickly fill up with plants, medicine, containers, cooked food and other ingredients you'll encounter on the way, forcing you to grapple with the usual constraints and trade-offs of inventory management. It goes without saying that the limit on inventory space prevents you from hoarding every item you come across, but Cairn has a creative mechanic that I think deserves a shout out. Your inventory isn't arranged like a grid or a menu, it's just a disorganized pile inside your bag. If it's already full but you come across something you really want to take with you, you can open it up and manually rearrange items, or just shake everything and hope it settles into a pattern with some cram space left at the top. During my first playthrough, my backpack was full for more or less the entire runtime, so I made a lot of use of this feature and came to appreciate it quite a lot as an alternative to the customary one in, one out inventory system that most games use. The only real annoyance here is that you can't directly consume items that you encounter without putting them into your inventory first, which would have helped to cut down on a bit of unnecessary bag shaking when all you wanted to do was eat some berries off a bush. When it comes to finding things to try and stuff into your bulging inventory, you can occasionally loot birds' nests or abandoned backpacks on your way up a wall, or get clever with it and lower yourself down to them from above, but most of what you pick up will be found while walking around on level ground in between climbs. Exploration is sometimes rewarded with unique upgrades, like a larger chalk bag, and you can even occasionally stumble into a set piece moment, but these mostly fell flat for me and don't really play to the game's strengths. The encounter with the bear, while surprising at first, seems particularly poorly considered to me, since the walking control scheme was very clearly not designed with escaping from danger in mind. The exploration in Cairn is at its best when it's used as a complement to the resource mechanics. With hunger and thirst meters perpetually draining no matter what you do, this means that there's a relatively light pressure constantly nudging you onwards and upwards to the next plateau, where you can look around and restock your supplies. I never found this pressure to be too overbearing, and there's no need to min-max to the extreme, but since reloading a save is as easy as swooping the camera over to a previous rest spot and selecting it, it can be very tempting to do so after wasting resources on a failed climb. There was only one section where I came anywhere close to running down my hunger meter because I spent way too long in the same area gathering optional collectibles that I was never going to use, and almost starved after exhausting all of the food nearby, which was definitely on me. Even then, in the end I didn't have to go too far to find another source of much needed nutrition, fresh from the goat. You might be wondering what the big deal is then. If food is so plentiful, then what's the point of the hunger meter in the first place? Well, part of the answer here is that most food needs to be prepared and cooked in order to maximize its usefulness, and this can only be done at designated camping spots, so managing your supply of food, ingredients and containers in between these spots is crucial. Cooked food will only stay hot for a limited time, after which it will no longer warm you up, adding yet another strand to the resource management web that becomes especially vital in the freezing temperatures near the summit. Depending on the ingredients you use while cooking, there are actually a few different effects you can stack into your meals, like increasing the speed of your limb movements or pausing all meters for a limited time. I didn't engage much with this because my tendency is to ignore temporary buffs in games, but it's nice to have the option, and I can see how other players might find it valuable. There is actually one more meter you need to pay attention to while playing that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's this one at the top of the screen. I suppose tradition dictates that I should call it a health bar, but in reality it functions a bit more like energy. The bar depletes if you take damage from a fall, as if you needed even more encouragement not to do that. But it also goes down if you hold the fast walk button, meaning you can trade health to increase your movement speed from excruciatingly slow to slightly less excruciatingly slow. Obviously, this is very funny, but something about the mechanics of this health bar just feels a little off to me. Like other survival meters, you can replenish health with food and consumables, but you can also restore it by passing time sleeping in your tent. This isn't weird by itself, but if you're careful to keep your health meter full, then there's zero reason to ever go to sleep. And in fact, it's a prudent strategy to avoid your bedroll at all costs and keep up your climb day and night, 24/7, rain or shine. Climbing at night or during bad weather may be marginally more difficult under decreased visibility or increased slipperiness, but sleeping until conditions improve comes at the, in my opinion, unacceptable cost of draining your hunger and thirst meters while you rest. Since holding onto my limited resources was way more important to me than making my climb easier, I chose to just switch on my torch and power through pretty much every time. To be clear, this was a choice that I made for myself based on my own priorities and resource management strategies, and broadly speaking, I think it's good that the game allows for different approaches to the problem of changing environmental conditions. But I also think it's kind of weird that a game attempting to simulate the dangerous pastime of mountain climbing lets you complete the whole thing without going to sleep once. Maybe there's a middle ground to be found here. If Ava's health started very slowly ticking down after too many hours without sleep, then players who wanted to push through would still have some leeway before collapsing, but they wouldn't be able to cheese the whole game. With all of the survival meters out of the way, that leaves us with just a few more consumable resources to cover, but this time they have a bit of a twist. While they take up space in your backpack just like anything else, these remaining resources are consumed, or not consumed, as a direct result of your chosen playstyle and your moment-to-moment decisions, which I think is a lot more interesting than just topping up the usual survival meters, a mechanic that's well implemented in Cairn, but also well trodden in plenty of other games. Starting with the least interesting of these rogue resources, chalk can be used at any time to give your fingers a dusting and increase your hand's grip for a certain number of holds. But again, my aversion to temporary buffs kept me from making much use of it. Based on the few times I did give it a try, I'm not entirely sure if limiting it by holds was the right call, since the imprecision in the game's controls can so frequently lead to you wasting moves by repeating yourself or correcting mistakes. In any case, this is a very minor nitpick, because using chalk is never necessary to proceed, and if it gives players another potential get-out-of-jail-free card to deploy in panic situations, then it's a welcome addition in my book. Moving slightly further along on the scale of intriguing resource mechanics, next up we have finger tape. I find this one to be an interesting case because on the one hand, interacting with it is objectively very boring, repetitive, and time-consuming, and yet on the other, I still feel like something worthwhile would be lost if the feature was removed. It's true that pausing and taking time to do this gives you a moment to steel yourself before or calm down after a stressful climb, but there are plenty of other quiet moments that accomplish the same thing, and I think the more likely reason the devs included it was so that you could see up close for yourself the lovingly rendered pound of flesh that the mountain can tear from an obsessive climber's hands. You could say the blood that cakes Ava's feet after a particularly strenuous climb achieves this effect too, but there's something to be said for actually having to interact with it and care for your damaged fingers yourself, even if the mechanics of it are very dull. I should point out that on a longer timescale, there is a bit more mechanical interaction happening here than there seems, since your own choices about where to place Ava's hands and how often you cause them to slip from the wall will dictate exactly how frequently your tape needs replacing. But since this builds up so slowly, it's more or less impossible to track cause and effect, and it's not going to have an impact on the decision making of anyone but the most fastidious of players. Which brings us to the final and most unique resource that Cairn asks the player to manage: pittance. These work a little differently to other resources in that your backpack has dedicated slots for 6 of them, meaning you'll always have free space for a good handful. If you already have 6, then any extras you pick up along the way will take up space in your backpack like a normal item, which is a trade-off that I think works well. At any point during a climb, you can stop and screw a piton into the wall, and there are 2 reasons you might want to do this. One is to create a custom checkpoint that you'll hang from if you fall later, and the other is to rest on the piton so that you can open your backpack, which is the only time you're allowed to do so while on a wall. It's a good idea to double up and combine these purposes as much as possible, which adds another layer of strategy to the climbing, but there's a catch and several limitations to using pitons that will force you to consider carefully when it's worth doing. Firstly, and most obviously, you're limited by the number of pitons you're carrying, so you need to be at least a little bit conservative with them if you want to avoid running out during a climb. Placing a piton also takes time, and your stamina will continue to deplete if you're in an insecure position, which can lead to you falling mid-placement if you're too indecisive or misjudge how much grip you have left. On top of that, some sections of wall are simply too tough to be pitoned, so whenever you encounter this sparkly rock, you either need to proceed very carefully or go to plan B and find a way around it. Those are the limitations to using pitons. The catch to using pitons is that when you step off the wall and have your climbot retrieve them for you, there's a chance they might come back to you broken, even if you ace the placement QTE. Broken pitons will take up space in your inventory until you're able to bring them to a bivouac spot, where you can feed 2 of them to climbot and make a fresh one. I'm not crazy about the fact that there's RNG involved here, since a simple durability mechanic could surely have achieved the same effect of making pitons transient and precious, but the percentage chances seem to be set low enough that it's not worth moaning about. Regardless of how it's achieved though, the point is that pitons are transient and precious, which gives the player an incentive to conserve them by going as far as possible in between placements, an incentive which is at direct odds with the instinct to avoid risk and to climb as safely as possible. The friction generated between these 2 opposing drives is one of the main sources of tension during a standard playthrough of Cairn, and the longer you wait before banking your progress with a piton, the higher the tension builds and the better it feels when a risk pays off. The choice of how to navigate this tension is one that's placed squarely in the player's hands, and you have the freedom to make and continually modify your plans in reaction to the climb you're up against and your current resource situation. Looking at the game through this lens, you can see that most of the mechanics feed back into this tension-creating dynamic. Every second you spend on a wall is another second eating away at your survival meters, so you're pushed to keep moving and make progress. But if this pressure causes you to make a mistake and fall, then you'll waste even more resources making up the loss. You want to climb as high as you can before using a piton, but when you suddenly find yourself in a tricky spot with stamina running out and deploy one in a panic, you've saved yourself at the cost of having 1 less piton at your disposal for the rest of the climb. Bringing all of this into view at once, you can see how the decisions made by the player on both long and short timescales are woven tightly together and continuously affect each other in Cairn. In a world of limited resources, the choices you make about how to use them have tangible consequences, always cost you something, and are genuinely meaningful. So now that all of the mechanical pieces are in place, I think it would be worth zooming out and looking at a playthrough of Cairn as a whole as I begin to wrap things up. And this would probably be the best place to put a few thoughts on the game's story and world too, though both are very much secondary to the gameplay-driven experience of this game. Cairn starts you off in the foothills of Kami, where you'll quickly start encountering the discontinued hiking trails, deserted campsites, decomposed corpses, and dilapidated cable cars that will introduce you to the narrative of the mountain's slow abandonment. Points of interest like these provide a change of pace after a grueling climb and are almost always your best bet for finding more resources, so you have a mechanical motivation to check them out, but there's usually something to read nearby that provides a bit of context and fleshes out the world too. As you continue upwards, the tourist hotspots give way to the outposts, settlements, and temples of the people who actually used to live on the mountain, the so-called troglodytes, and you can meet a couple of stragglers who stayed behind after everyone else left. I wasn't especially interested in the troglodyte lore, but climbing over their architecture presents new challenges and adds some welcome variety to the gameplay. It's around this time, after seeing Ava properly interacting with other characters, that the player will reach the unavoidable conclusion that she's a pretty unlikable protagonist. If you've checked the Steam reviews for the game, then you'll know that this seems to be a sticking point for a lot of players. I'm certainly not going to try and defend Ava's behaviour. She's rude to everyone she meets, she never replies to radio messages despite being on a very dangerous climb that could kill her at any time. The people in both her personal and professional lives seem to tiptoe around her temper.
I hope everything's okay, and my messages aren't making you angry.
And to top it all off, this monster didn't even give her Climbot a name. Despicable. It's undeniable that Ava doesn't exactly make for pleasant company, but I don't think that's necessarily cause for complaint. Not every story needs to be about nice people, and I mean, it makes a lot of sense that somebody whose vocation involves being alone for long stretches of time would be hard to get along with and push everyone else away. If she had a more agreeable temperament, then she probably wouldn't be on the mountain to begin with.
Send me some news.
More or less every other character in the game exists only to reveal more about Ava, which is fine, she is the protagonist after all, but her main dramatic foil in the story is the junior climber Marco, who makes his first appearance somehow overtaking the veteran mountaineer Ava around a third of the way up the mountain. It's through her conversations with him during the ascent that we learn the most about Ava's perspective and what motivates her, which definitely helps to soften her up a bit, and I think begins to show that she's actually not so different from the player after all.
Or to hold your entire body between your thumb and your forefinger.
This particular line comes about 2/3 into the game, immediately after reaching the top of the Peril, the seemingly endless wall above the troglodyte temple that is easily the most daunting and exhausting in the game, and an amazing make or break moment for the player. Anybody who's been wavering in their commitment to beating the game will take one look at it and say nope before promptly quitting. But even the most determined first-time player will balk when they tilt the camera upwards and realise that yes, they really are expected to climb all that in one go. I'm sure it's no coincidence that this revealing conversation about dedication and resolve comes only after the player has proven that they're in possession of both. It's not long after this that the ice boots are introduced, and this changes less than you might think, since you still always have the freedom to choose your own route and avoid icy patches if you want to. But at the very least, the player does have to start taking temperature more seriously as they get closer to the summit and food sources begin to dwindle. The last bit of plot comes just before the final stretch, when Ava and Marco meet a famous climber who went missing and was presumed dead over a decade ago. It turns out he's somehow been surviving just below the peak for the last 12 years, unable to muster the will to continue, but also unwilling to go back down and admit defeat. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but again it works as a metaphorical foil for Ava's own quest. It's repeatedly hammered home that the next stage of the climb is the one that nobody has ever conquered. There are spikes and corpses all over the place, and a room full of abandoned backpacks that served as your last chance to loot up and fill your inventory. Unexpectedly, the player is actually given a choice here about whether to leave the mountain with Marco or continue onto the summit despite the overwhelming evidence that it will probably end in death. Arguably, heading back down is the good choice that would show the most development for Ava's character, but I think very few players would be satisfied with quitting after coming so far and getting so close to the top. The fact that the game asks you to reaffirm Yore and Ava's commitment like this seems to me like the payoff to the earlier setup of her similarities with the player. Both Ava and the player clearly have a thing for pursuing arbitrary and difficult goals with no associated extrinsic rewards. Neither will get anything for reaching the summit of Kami, besides whatever internal satisfaction it brings them, and yet just by itself, that can be the most powerful driving force there is. As always when in the realm of metaphor, however, there's room to quibble about this attempted commentary on player motivation, and you could argue that it's not really necessary. Every hand and foot the player has placed so far, and every disastrous fall they've recovered from on the way here, already stand as obvious proof of their resolve, so boiling the question all the way down to a single button prompt right at the end like this is only spelling out what we already know in a clumsily heavy-handed way. There's some truth to that, and I think this moment is really here for Ava's sake rather than for the players, but in the game's defense, it's possible to completely skip the question by ignoring Marco and simply heading straight for the wall like the ultimate self-motivated Sigma, so in the end it's really all in your hands whether you care about sharing this final hurdle with Ava or keeping it to yourself. When it comes to the mechanics of climbing this supposedly deadly wall, I found it to be a bit of an anticlimax. You'll be well stocked on supplies after leaving the graveyard below, and should be comfortable enough with icy surfaces by now that you can make steady progress without too much trouble. The twist that gets thrown at you halfway up, when a series of avalanches start falling on you and force you to hurry to the top without pittance, didn't feel particularly dangerous or thrilling to me, especially because the avalanche doesn't really seem to do anything besides making you hold still for a few seconds. Ava's repeated voice lines about the danger and the need to move quickly only further dampened the tension for me, as they felt at odds with the relatively harmless mechanical effect that the avalanche actually has. Once you're past it and into Enchanted territory, you're really in the final chapter of the game, with only a small handful of climbs left to go, and in a welcome contrast to the feebleness of the avalanche, some genuine tension is introduced when all of your survival meters are shrunk to 1/3 of their previous size. This is a great example of changing the mechanical rules to increase pressure on the player in an understandable way. You're immediately aware that you're going to start chewing through your limited resources more quickly, and immediately feel the stakes and urgency rising. Weirdly, this final summit up to the peak is by far the section of the game with the highest walking to climbing ratio, and if you thought the walking speed was slow before, then just wait until you see this. I suppose the purpose of this is to slow the game right down and draw out this last stretch where the player is at their most vulnerable, which makes sense, but since this is achieved by asking you to hold forward while you try not to get too bored, I'm not sure it sticks the landing. Once you're actually on a wall, you can climb and move just as quickly as usual anyway, so it's not really consistent, and the pruning of your survival bars is a far more effective way of making the player feel desperate than just showing them a character who looks desperate. After a lot of walking and a few short walls, at long last we get to the final climb, up to the very peak of Kami and the highest point of Ava's world. At some point your climbot, nameless soldier that he is, breaks down due to the extreme conditions and leaves you unable to place pittance, eventually leading to another choice to make between cutting it loose or dragging its weight behind you. It turns out that this is a false choice with no real consequences, since there's no penalty for carrying it with you, unless you count the jankiness of a free-swinging physics object bouncing around the screen as a penalty, but I guess it adds a bit of flavour. And that brings us to the ending of Cairn, as Ava and the player, with or without Climbot, finally reach the peak they've been striving for. You're given a few moments to enjoy the taste of victory and reflect on what it's taken to get here, before things take an abstract and inconclusive turn that's largely left up to interpretation. This star-mounting closing scene could just be here to let us share in the cosmic contentment that Ava feels after giving up everything to reach her goal. Or you could read it more pessimistically and conclude that moments after reaching the top of the world, she's already dreaming about new ways to escape her life by going even higher. Either way, the player's own intrinsic satisfaction with having beaten a difficult and demanding game is something that can't be shown on screen, and takes place only in their head. As I've been suggesting throughout this video, that feeling is your true reward for reaching the end of Cairn, and I can only speak for myself, but I found it to be a gratifying one that was worth the trouble. Which is why, as soon as the credits finished rolling, I went straight back to the file select menu and started a new run in free solo mode to see just how far I could take it. This mode changes enough about the experience and about the feelings you get from going through it that I think it's worth a paragraph or two before I move on to my conclusion. The major difference is that there are no pittons and permadeath is in effect, so falling from a large height is almost guaranteed to kill you and end your run. Since pittons are a key method for papering over the inconsistency in the game's controls and lessening the impact of falls that aren't your fault, this can lead to a lot of misery, frustration and wasted hours in free solo, so doing the developer's job for them and using the menu to make the controls consistent is a requirement. You also start your run with a free rewind item that will be consumed to save you from exactly one lethal fall, which gives you a small bit of leeway while still keeping the tension high. It's possible to get more of these rewind flowers throughout the run, but only one is on the critical path, and the others require lengthy and dangerous detours, so you need to make a calculated trade-off based on how much risk, resource, and time spent is acceptable to you. Free solo mode excels at turning decisions like this into monumental ones that will either make or break your run, and the pressure you feel to make the right choice speaks for itself. Even when you're not on the wall, the tension never goes away, and you're constantly hyper aware that a single bad call will spell your doom now, or worse, lead to an unwinnable situation later on. This extends to other upgrades and items you can find on the mountain as well. In a normal playthrough, descending into this well to grab an upgraded flask with higher capacity is a total no-brainer, and it's easily done by just lowering yourself down, grabbing it, and rappelling back up. On free solo mode, however, going out of your way for this upgrade becomes a question with real danger associated with it, since you not only have to get yourself down there without a piton, you also have to get back up. I agonized over this choice for a good while, knowing that it would cost me time, resources, and no small amount of risk, but deciding that I'd need the larger flask to make it through the upcoming ordeal of the peril. Part of the reason I decided this was worth it is that having no pitons also means that it's impossible to open your inventory mid-climb, since this is usually done while resting on one. Since you won't have access to your inventory, you're forced to prepare meticulously in advance for each wall by making sure your stomach is full enough to make it all the way in one go, or for longer climbs by getting a bigger flask and filling it with soup or something else that can be sipped to fill all of your survival meters at once. On top of all this, your inventory space is drastically reduced in free solo, so you can't hoard supplies and need to pick your loot carefully to be ready for the challenges ahead. As you might imagine, playing free solo on a first playthrough is highly discouraged, since so much of the planning it asks you to do relies on having foreknowledge of which sections of the mountain are coming up next. So it's clear enough that free solo is more difficult and more punishing in almost every way you can imagine, but still I think it's quite doable, and I'd recommend that anyone who enjoyed a standard playthrough give it a try. There's a kind of clarity that comes from being able to forget about pitons and safety and backup plans and just focus intently on one problem at a time with everything on the line, holding all of your hours of progress between your thumb and forefinger. I humble bragged about it quite casually earlier, but in actual fact, reaching the mountain summit in free solo mode brought me some of the highest feelings of triumph and achievement I've ever had while gaming, along with more anxiety, pressure, and sustained terror than I've ever had from horror games. Of course, you can't have that triumph without that terror of losing it all, and as I found myself reaching closer and closer to the peak, as it slowly dawned on me that I was actually gonna make it, I was actually fucking doing it, the hours of built-up tension crested into a titanic wave of relief and elation that was stronger than any I've felt in recent gaming memory. If the dev team's goal with Cairn was to bring that aspect of climbing to a controller, then I can't give them a higher compliment than that. On the surface, Cairn looks like a pretty simple game, and in some ways it's not so different from the ones I opened this video with. Putting the survival mechanics to one side for a moment, the vast majority of a playthrough consists of looking for your next handhold, selecting the limb you want to move there, and then moving it there. This incredibly short, seconds-long cycle of gameplay is periodically punctuated by more complicated formations that require more imaginative maneuvers and keep you from getting complacent. As the game oscillates back and forth like this, it's constantly daring you to eat into your supply of pitons to relieve some of the built-up tension, but the limited nature of that supply means that it's always worth trying to hold out for a few meters more before deploying one, and then a few meters more, and a few meters more. In other words, Cairn is a game that happily gives you tools you can use to minimize frustration, but also mechanically incentivizes you to push the tension of a climb as far as you can. And this concept finds its obvious climax in free solo mode. Ordinarily, I don't have much interest in replaying games immediately after finishing them, and I definitely not usually want to switch on permadeath, but free solo is such a perfect fit for Cairn's concept that it just felt natural to jump back in and try it, and control hiccups aside, it was exactly the culmination I'd hoped it would be. Another key aspect of Cairn's formula is that instead of forcing you to follow a path defined in advance by the developers, it asks you, and actually demands of you, that you make a path for yourself. And thanks to that, it's a little tricky to talk about difficulty in this game. The long ordeal of the peril is the example that I keep coming back to. not only because it's the section where you're most likely to have your resources and pit and management stretched to their limit, but also because it offers the clearest demonstration of what I've been saying throughout this video about the game taking place in your head. If you can make it far enough to reach this gargantuan wall, then you've almost certainly acquired the skills you need to beat it. The only attack it has against you is intimidation through its sheer size, and all you need to do to counter that attack is summon the determination to beat it. In a way, inspiring the player to find that determination within themselves is what Cairn is all about, and that's what's really being tested when you come up against a wall or problem that seems impossible. It's almost always easier than you thought once you're past the mental hurdle. So all of this points towards Cairn being a standout example of the climb 'em up genre, but it continues to go a step further than most with its inclusion of survival mechanics, which add another layer of strategy to climbing and introduce stakes that are persistent even when you're exploring on foot in between climbs. The really ingenious effect of those survival mechanics, however, is that they turn your entire playthrough into one long continuous struggle, where even standing still is an action that costs you something as your meters tick down, and each moment of gameplay is a direct result of all the ones before it. In many climbing games, the player's path forwards can be broken down into chunks that are totally independent of each other, where your performance in one section has zero effect on later ones. Either you land the jump and reach the next section, or you don't and you try again. In Cairn, not only your position and stamina, but also the state of your inventory and survival meters are all directly dependent on the choices you've made throughout your entire playthrough so far, giving weight to those choices and making your ascent of Kami feel like one big level from start to finish. I'm certain that presenting the game in this way was a priority for the developers, since they went out of their way to provide several different features that show you your personal route up the mountain. Even after you've reached the peak on a save, it remains in the file select menu to let you swoop around it with a camera and reminisce over the path you took. It should be clear by now that, as a mechanical experience, Cairn is brushing up against brilliance, only held back by the unfortunate but mostly forgivable clumsiness in its controls. This is a game that doesn't hold the player's hand and trusts them enough to set them loose in a world dense with consequential decisions, but at the same time, it clearly wants to see you find your way to the end and gives you plenty of tools to help make that happen. Despite her hostile demeanour, I think Ava does a good job at standing in for the player within the narrative and making the commentary on the price of determination a little more concrete. But for the most part, the game has the self-confidence to just let the experience of climbing speak for itself. Taken as a whole, that experience is an original and refreshing one that gave me a lot to chew on, and as you can tell from this video, led to a lot of navel-gazing about the nature of games and why we play them. It may have a few cracks in it, but there's no question that Cairn is an unmissable game at the peak of its genre.